Welcome. I'm David Johnson. I'm the President and CEO of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership and also the BioCrossroads Initiative, which is the oldest of the standing sector and economic development initiatives of CICP. This is a terrific crowd. The NCAA and Mark Emmert are CICP board members, and we love doing events over here, and they are very gracious to allow us to do it. This event really kind of for us had to be done here because it's fundamental to a big part of the Indianapolis story that Bruce and Jeremy do such a wonderful job of telling in the new Localism book, Chapter 5, for those of you who have your copies there. But it's also indicative, what we have here, it's indicative of what this community can do and how it can really turn strategic strengths and keep moving in new directions, even when success has been achieved in one area to move to a new one. And let me explain what that means. I grew up here. I grew up when, actually at the early part of Chapter 5, when they talk about Indianapolis not having a lot going on. I remember it as Naptown, Indianopolis. Those were the kind words for it. It was also thought of really just as the city of Indianapolis. The surrounding counties and region really weren't part of the ideas that we had about ourselves. Everything was kind of compact here. And it was not a place, it was not a destination location for Americans, and even for a lot of people who grew up here. A lot of us left and really didn't intend to come back. And when I came back here in 1983, I found a very different city already in the making, and that was because prior to that, just the year prior to that, a group of civic leaders had come together and said, let's get the National Sports Festival to be held here. We'd never done an event like that. There's no particular reason to have an event like that here. We had the 500 and we had the Indiana Pacers, but that was about it in terms of sports teams. Let's get the National Sports Festival to come in here and see what we can do with that. And they did. And they organized it well, and the city portrayed itself well, and people got pretty excited about that and thought, boy, we're pretty good at that. So then it was time to build the convention center and get more into the convention business. And someone came up with the idea, well, let's build part of the convention center that looks like a football stadium. Now, it isn't a football stadium because we don't have a team, but let's make it look like a football stadium in case we ever got a team. But it's still the convention center. And then, of course, as many of you know, another group of courageous civic volunteers, one of which was connected to a moving company, went out to Baltimore and said, you know, we got this really cool facility that if you wanted to move your team here, you could set up and play some really awesome football in Indianapolis. And so the Baltimore Colts arrived here in the dead of night in 1984 on a roll. So around this same time, the mayor of Indianapolis, Bill Hudnut, is getting very interested in attracting a lot of the amateur athletic organizations under the USOC Olympic Committee. And so we end up going out and recruiting 4 or 5 headquarters operations for the different Olympic sports, including the National Rowing Association, which was convinced to put its headquarters here, despite the fact that Indianapolis is the largest city in the world that is not on a navigable body of water. But, you know, again, it was a compelling offer. And then a group of people found out that the Pan American Games, which were supposed to be played in Cuba, they were not going to happen. And so they went down to Cuba in 1987, which was not an easy thing to do then, and negotiated to have the Pan American Games hosted here, which was an enormous event that really transformed the city. And then things just kept getting better through the late 80s, early 90s, and some of that same group of courageous civic volunteers and philanthropists got wind in the mid-90s that the NCAA might be frustrated in its current home in Overland Park, Kansas, because if you've ever seen those facilities that were in Overland Park, Kansas, the city made a bet on putting them in an area they thought the city would grow into or out into. And instead, they picked the wrong suburban area, and the NCAA's facilities were really isolated from the rest of Kansas City and from the airport and everything else. And so their lease was about to be renewed out there, and the same group of people that thought about going and getting football teams and amateur athletic organizations went to Kansas City and said, you know, why don't you move to Indianapolis? We'll get you real close to where the action is. We'll help get you some land. we'll build you some great facilities. We'll make it happen for you. And they said, sounds good to us. And so all of a sudden, NCAA is moving here in 1997, 1998, 1999. And it really doesn't get any better than that, because with the NCAA came all the programming, all the Final Four events of men's and women's basketball, all the cool things that brought a huge amount of not just money into the economy, but excitement into this place. And a sense that everybody had that, you know what, this is a really cool place to live. People like coming here. They like coming to events here. It's really awesome. And I think at that point, it might have been possible for a number of people to say, job done. We've really created this new community. It's doing fine. We've got a lot of buy-in from the corporate community and philanthropic community, and let's just go ahead and chart the new future. Instead, that's not what happened. And instead, many of the same group of people who had gone out and really activated the sports strategy, and a few others as well, came together and said, we're about to enter the 21st century, and we're not sure that sports events and tourism is going to be enough in whatever's going on in the world of technology and whatever is happening with universities, which just at that time were getting into the whole tech transfer business. In really thinking about who we are and what's going on, should we be doing something else that's really aimed at whatever's coming in the 21st century? Everybody had sort of the first taste in the 90s, the dot-com revolution and bubble to some extent. What's going to happen behind that, and are we really ready for it? This community had had some success in the 90s under Mayor Goldsmith, actually, in really exploring the possibilities of being a tech community, and there are some tech entrepreneurs here who set up shop and did very well in the late 80s and 90s and built the foundation for much of what we have today. But what more could there be? And so that's how the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership ultimately ended up being put together. And it was put together, again, by those same courageous folks who said, we need to have a leadership group of the executive leadership, the CEOs of our leading companies, our foundations, and the presidents of our universities, coming together and figuring out what's next, and working closely, hand in glove, with our partners in state and local government, because obviously many of those things would involve policy action and public funding even. And it began in 2000, an organization that has ended up working very closely with our partners, such as the Indy Chamber here in particular, the State Chamber, the Manufacturers Association, many other groups across the state, but working in close concert with the corporate community, the philanthropic community, and with this group of leaders who sit on our board to really try to help figure out what the next chapters of the strategy for this region might be. And we thought and think, because it's a dynamic, ongoing process for all of us who are involved in it, it's working here. It has worked for us to do some things. But we never really thought about whether that was something that would be remarkable or significant or anybody else would think was a cool thing. It was just a strategy that worked for us. About a year ago, we were contacted by Bruce Katz, who has spent a lot of time out here over the years. The Brookings Institution and the Metropolitan Policy Program that Bruce and Amy Liu, who you'll meet here in a moment, both of them co-founded in the mid-90s, has done a lot of good work out here. They do a lot of good work today with the Indy Chamber, for example, in the whole inclusive growth initiative, where Indianapolis and San Diego and Nashville, I believe, are the cities that are involved in that. They've done a lot of work in the global cities area. Bruce, as you will see in a moment, is a pretty darn compelling speaker, so he was often invited to come out here, and he looked around, and he's a person that pays a lot of attention to the places that he visits. And so a year ago, he called us and said, we're going to write this book, and we're looking for some examples of interesting ways that people have organized their economic development ecosystems sort of beyond the traditional norm, and you guys seem interesting to us. We don't know, but you seem interesting to us. Do you have any information you could send us? Boy, I am the wrong guy to ask a question like that to. We had a lot, and my colleague Lori and I downloaded, I think, the largest data dump that we have ever done to anybody on poor Bruce and his colleagues, because we had everybody there were a lot of lawyers who put CICP together, so they all saved their stuff. So we had notes, we had the briefing books for all the stuff that came together. We just gave them all of this. And they came back, as we saw a draft of this a few months later, with a story of us that we really liked and we actually learned a lot from. We're still learning from it. There were some things in the slide presentation you're about to see that make us look smarter than we ever thought we were going into all this. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning, is where this region, and when I say Indianapolis, I'm talking about the region. Indy is probably the even better way to coin that. But this region fits into the ongoing, emerging, exciting story of what's happening in 21st century economic development in some pretty compelling ways. And you're going to hear Bruce talk about that, and then we're going to really spin that story out a little more in the panel discussion we'll have after that Melina Kennedy is going to moderate for us. And when you do, I think it will make all of you feel good about what this region and city are about and what we can do and what we have done, but also what we could do going forward. But I think it's also will give you, in this conversation, will give you a sense of what the stakes are, what the opportunities look like, and how fast things are moving and how nimble we're all going to have to be working together to make some really big things continue to happen here. So let me go ahead and we're going to have a panel discussion following Bruce's comments with Bruce and his colleague and partner in writing the book, Jeremy Nowak, Amy Liu, and also Mayor Hogsett is going to join that conversation as well. But first, to start it off, I'm going to introduce Bruce. Bruce Katz is the Centennial Scholar of the Brookings Institution. He's an urban expert, and he's someone that probably many of you have heard speak in the past. He focuses on the challenges and opportunities of global urbanization. He's been at Brookings for more than 20 years, and again, as I mentioned a moment ago, he and Amy co-founded the Metropolitan Division. Was it 1995, 1996, somewhere around that? Together with Amy and Mark Muro from Brookings and other Brookings colleagues here, these folks have really redefined the language that we use to talk about 21st century economic development. When you hear us talk about innovation districts at 16 Tech, when you hear us talk about advanced industries, which is basically the different sectors that we are all excited about here, advanced manufacturing and biotechnology and tech, those are Brookings concepts. These folks have really looked at what's going on and have provided a very helpful framework and vocabulary to talk about it. Inclusive economic development is another concept that they are truly advancing as they focus on the metro level. And we're going to talk about that a lot here today, too. So these folks have given us the language, the framework, and the intellectual constructs that we need to really figure out what it is we're doing along the way. And we will dive into that today and see where we take this discussion and where we take that language and where the next opportunities are going to come. So Bruce, come on up.
Thanks. So I want to start by just thanking David for being like a hoarder, and all the other lawyers in this town, because the work and the material and the documents that we used to construct the story were in people's attics and in garages. It wasn't, online. So thank you for that. And I also want to just acknowledge that this is obviously an Indianapolis story, but what you all have done is also connected to other parts of the state. So I just want to acknowledge Mayor Pete is here from South Bend. There was someone last night from Fort Wayne, and really smart thinking about how to, not just from a political perspective, think about Indianapolis in the context of a region or a state, but with real, true economic linkages and connectivity. So this was a lot of fun to write, and as you'll see, I'm going to talk about 3 stories from the book, Pittsburgh and Indianapolis and Copenhagen. And I have to say, as Jeremy and I go around the country and outside the country, this is the story people want to talk about for a whole bunch of reasons that we should discuss as we go forward. So everything has changed, right? That's the title of one of our chapters. The economy, technology, society, demographics. I mean, this is a very volatile period, both in the United States and around the world, and it's been going on for quite some time because of globalization. And this is what we focus on. We focus on the political repercussions of dynamic change. And we focus on the rise of what we call angry populism, which for the most part is meant to exploit real grievances that are out there around economic insecurity and cultural anxiety. But what people don't focus enough on is structural change. And what's happening in the world today is globalization is diminishing the role of the nation state and elevating the role of the city state. And that's because what the market wants, whether we're here, whether we're in Europe, whether we're in China, or whether we're somewhere else, is it wants what cities have: the agglomeration, the aggregation, the concentration, the co-location of different kinds of economic assets. Anchor institutions like universities, mature companies, and you have many of those, startups, scale-ups, incubators, accelerators, investors, all within relatively small geographies where you can begin to share ideas and co-generate and co-create solutions. And so we're in a world, we're in an urban world, we're in an urban age, we're in a bottom-up world where basically any city that gets its act together can innovate on products and innovate on solutions and basically get above the rest, essentially, and get recognition both in economic and other terms. So cities matter because they do have this concentration and agglomeration effect, and that's why we have innovative and productive economies both here and elsewhere. And when you put those economies on steroids, you create economic opportunity for a lot of people, not just those with the doctorates, right, or even the four-year degrees, but a lot of people who have the credentials and the skills to participate. You got to work on that. You got to be intentional about it. You got to be purposeful about it. But cities naturally have that cycle. Cities are very diverse. They're really on the front lines of demographic transformation. And in this country, as you all know, we will be majority minority by the 2040s. So they're in the front lines of that. And new kinds of democratic participation are being created so that we can bring more people into the mainstream. And finally, cities are really good at sustainable development. Because at the end of the day, whether you believe in climate change or not, I believe in it. There's a piece in the New York Times today about Cape Town running out of water. You should read that article. Cities basically combine energy, buildings, and transport. And if you do it in very tight ways and ways that sort of connect to each other, you have sustainable development. It's not rocket science. I mean, it's just how the world kind of works. So cities matter. They matter more than ever, and more than half of the world's population now lives in cities. So we are seeing a shift in power and responsibility in the world. It is shifting down from nation states to the city states. It's shifting from the public sector horizontally to public, private, civic, university, community, labor, right? It's a horizontal world, not a hierarchical world. It's beginning to shift to places that can think about solving problems, not just across sectors, but across disciplines. Because in the 20th century, we thought about if you have a traffic problem, go to the Department of Transportation. If you have an education problem, go to the Department of Education. We thought in terms of specialization and compartmentalization and bureaucracy. In the 21st century, problems are solved by having multiple cracks from people and disciplines with different expertise, different kind of experiences. If you have a traffic problem, the solution might be technology, or it may be having housing located near jobs, right? So this is a different century, and we're seeing power, therefore, structurally, not just cyclically because of political upheaval, shift down. So we call this new localism. I think we robbed it from someone. I mean, someone was writing about new localism or localism a couple years ago, but we figured it wasn't trademark. Let's stab it. We're Americans, right? And we said this could be a philosophy and practice for the 21st century, which is really about problem solving, right? Whatever your problem is, social mobility, the aging of your city or your county, environmental questions, whatever the problem is, it is more likely that there are a group of people, institutions, leaders, that are trying to crack at the problem here at this level, city, county, metropolis, regional, rather than in the constitutional sovereigns, the national government and the state governments. We think this is a new way of moving the country forward and making places prosperous, resilient, and ultimately inclusive. Now, if you're in a bottom-up world, what you need are not rules or regulations to rain down from on high. What you need are norms. You need models. You need to find places that are really doing a good job at growth or governance or finance, or all three of those, so you can adapt and adopt them across cities, across countries, across legal regimes, across cultures. So that was the hunt we had at the beginning of this book. Okay, what are the norms? Who's the best at growth? Who's the best at governance? Who's the best at finance in a 21st century urban world? And so we basically focused on Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, and Copenhagen. So let's go to Pittsburgh first. Gorgeous city. How many people have been to Pittsburgh? I mean, absolutely gorgeous city, right? You couldn't ask for a better location. Well, this is what it looked like in 1973. I guarantee you no one could breathe in Pittsburgh, all right? And it's because the steel industry was the center of its economy and really the center of the global steel industry. Well, that all collapsed in the late 1970s, right? Tens of thousands of jobs disappeared overnight. The salvation and the beginning of Pittsburgh renewal started here. This is 3 Mile Island. There was a small nuclear disaster that you might remember. And at the same time, the steel industry collapsed. And a bunch of Pittsburgh corporations, Westinghouse included, started to think about how are we going to repair the damage? Because they had nuclear waste flooding the basements of this thing, right? And they had big ideas, tens of millions, hundreds of millions to clean this thing up. None of them were working. So eventually they had to go and find this guy, sitting on top of whatever he's sitting on top of. Red Whitaker, okay? The man is a complete brainiac. I guarantee you spend 10 minutes with this guy, you're on Mars, you're on Jupiter, you're all over the place, right? He's one of the first roboticists in the United States. And he started building, with philanthropic money, a center of excellence on robots. But mobile robots, not the robots that stood in the car manufacturing plants and just sprayed paint as the cars went by. These were like flexible robots, mobile robots that he could control. And so he basically said to Westinghouse and Bechtel and everyone else, let's send a whole group of robots into the basement of 3 Mile Island and let's assess the damage. And that's what they did. It cost $1 million. And such began the robot revolution in Pittsburgh. Now, the thing about Pittsburgh is they're a bit like you. All these assets are located in like the magic square mile. You go to Carnegie Mellon, you fall out of bed, you're in the University of Pittsburgh. You fall out of the University of Pittsburgh, you're in the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. This is an early 20th century geography that has completely been revalued by the 21st century, because if you want an innovative economy, you're not waiting for a guy sitting in his garage to invent something. You want a networked ecosystem. You want to share ideas. And if you want to share ideas, it's based to do face-to-face within that 1 square mile, or a 1/4 square mile, or frankly in the same building. That's why Pittsburgh is so powerful. And they're very powerful in next generation technologies. And if you want to be in an economy that succeeds in the 21st century, you want to be in one of those technologies that are going from the lab to prototyping to ubiquitous adoption, because guaranteed in 15 years this will be half of global GDP. All these technologies that 40 years ago in Pittsburgh, no one even had a name for them. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data analytics, autonomous vehicles. We didn't even have a name for this stuff. But in Pittsburgh, they began to invest in centers of excellence that ultimately spun this stuff out. Now, Pittsburgh is sort of like the it city right now. You know, a whole bunch of young people want to go there because it's like an innovation playground, and they celebrate success, and if you're a really smart kid, they just throw money at you, right? But if you're a technology company out of Silicon Valley, you also have to be in Pittsburgh. You have to be near the secret sauce. Smart people, talented people, innovative companies, a collaborative ecosystem, right? And they're all there. You go to Pittsburgh, Uber's driving around their autonomous vehicles. A city has to think like a system. You have to think across all these different dimensions of the 21st century economy, and then you have to act like an entrepreneur. You have to take risks. You have to invest in things that people don't even understand because you just have a gut sense that that's where things are going. And Pittsburgh has moved from being the Rust Belt to the Brain Belt. They're building on their historic legacy. They're not denying who they were. They were a maker city. They just make different things now, right? And philanthropy, like yours, has invested for the long haul and taken risks. And that's when you win. So let's go to Indianapolis, because a lot of people hear the Pittsburgh story and they say, it's just Carnegie Mellon, you know? If we all had Carnegie Mellon, we would be great. That's not true, but we understand that's a view of the world. So let's go to Indianapolis. You know, if you go back to the mid-1970s, this is the reality, right? Your core had basically lost any sense of place. The heart of your city, of your county, of your metropolis had literally nothing going on. You know, and Kurt Vonnegut, who was, you know, one of your native sons, basically said that in Indianapolis, you spend 364 days playing miniature golf, and on the 365th day, you go to the Speedway. Okay, that's why it began to get this sense of a sort of a sleepy place. So what you all decided to do, going back to the mid-70s, early 80s, was to become the amateur sports capital of the universe, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons that you could look at in the book of how you decided to do that. But you made a lot of smart facility investments, all in a relatively small geography. You understood that it wasn't just becoming the amateur sports capital, but restoring the core, right? Giving a reason for people to come to a relatively small geography. And then you went out and you stole the Baltimore Colts. So, you know, on top of it all, you took risks. And there's a great story in the book also about sending trucks out and moving vans and all the rest of it to make that happen without anyone knowing what really was about to take place. You created an entity, the Indiana Sports Corporation, which was like an early version in the US of collaborative governance, of network governance, of corporate leaders, working with university leaders, working with philanthropy, working with the government. Right? In most parts of the world, these sectors never intersect, right? They just stay in their lane, and each does what they do. But you understood that if you were able to put these sectors together, 2 + 2 = 5. And after you got the NCAA to come here, and by the way, there's a great quote in the book about Kansas City basically just giving up, you know, because they were up against Indianapolis. And you were just hell-bent on bringing the NCAA here. You understood it wasn't just a headquarters facility. You were going to get all the games, right, and all that represented. At some point in the late 90s, you realized, though, sports can't be it. Tourism can't be it. I mean, how much beer and hot dogs can you sell? You had to go to the higher level. And there was incredible intentionality here, unbelievable purposefulness to say, we need to create an institution, the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. We need to back it with private and civic capital. And then what we need to do is invest at scale in a sustained way in those sectors of the economy that we're really, really, really good at. So evidence-driven, outcome-oriented, backed by capital. BioCrossroads is the obviously, you know, the sort of apex of this, because you are really good at life science, right? Second biggest exporter of life science products in the United States after California, Indiana, right? So you understood we're going to be the best 21st century version of yourselves. And we're going to start with BioCrossroads, and we're going to move out to these other sectors of the economy, and we're going to invest at scale in a sustained way in angel investment, in seed investment, in venture fund investment, and in creating the Indiana Bioscience Research Institute, right? $150 million of private and civic capital, which is on its way to $300 million, right? This is 21st century economic development. No one's waiting for a grant from the EDA or the Appalachian Regional Commission, right? It ain't coming. It's gonna be built from the wealth here. So be an ecosystem rather than an ecosystem, right? That's what collaborative governance means. It doesn't mean you don't have leaders. It's just they put their ego in check, right? And they basically work together to achieve grand things together that no one can do by themselves. You have perfected, and this is why so many people are interested in you, the mechanics of collaboration. When these 60 CEOs from different corporate universities and philanthropies meet, they meet to decide rather than discuss. This is not a debating society. This is a doing society, right? You have perfected that. You're operating at the district level, the city level, the metropolitan level, the regional level, the state level. You're operating at all levels. You get it, for politics and for the economy. And you are organizing private and civic wealth, right? Because the federal government, last time we checked, is a health insurance company with an army. If you think they're going to rebuild your economy, I have some land to sell you in southern Florida. Last piece is Copenhagen, and this is a really important story. Now, how many people have been to Copenhagen? You must all be cyclists or something. But big city, 600,000 people, 2 million in the metro, extends into southern Sweden. People do like to bike, I mean, to work, to school. But what's interesting about Copenhagen is how much power resides at the local level. It's been devolved. Now, 30 years ago, this city had 18% unemployment and was fiscally bankrupt. It's not the Copenhagen we think of today. It was flat on its back. And basically, the city leaders and the national leaders said, we're going to have to make a big investment. We're going to build a subway system for the entire city and metropolis. Oh, guess what? We can't tax the citizenry. They'll revolt. We have to come up with a new way to basically fund billions and billions of kroners to build out this transit system. So they created an institution, the Copenhagen City and Port Development Corporation. It's publicly owned and it's professionally managed, right? They took all this land in the north harbor of the harbor because the harbor basically had lost its raison d'etre. Southern Sweden had become the port. They took all this land in the harbor and in the area of the Orestad district between the downtown and the airport, and they put it under this corporation, publicly owned, professionally managed, insulated from politics. And they basically said to these folks, you need to manage the disposition of public assets so that we get the revenue to service the debt on a major transit system. Fast forward to today, they are building one of the world's great transit systems, not a dollar of taxes. Now, think about the US. The government owns a lot in the United States. Local government, county government, state government, Port Authority, Airport Authority, Stadium Authority, Parking Authority, Convention Center, and we got a lot of authorities, right? So the government owns a lot, but we don't manage our assets to get the yield to invest in what we know we have to invest in the public side, infrastructure in particular. So the head of the Copenhagen City and Port basically says, they're not here for a quick fix. Most American cities, they find out what they own, they sell it off to fill a budget gap that year. That's the quick fix. Copenhagen's in for the long haul. And what they've figured out is it's not enough for a city to know what it owes, you need to know what you own. And you need to know the value of what you own. And then you need to manage the disposition of that value so you ultimately can invest in other stuff. That's what Copenhagen has done. That's what Hamburg has done. That's what Helsinki has done. That's what Hong Kong has done. We are still in some mid-20th century kind of public finance model in this country. We have got to change. This national government, like Elvis, it has left the building, right? And states, enough said. So, how do we build a nation of problem solvers? And, here's the problem. For every Pittsburgh, there's dozens of cities that are subsidizing consumption rather than investing in innovation. For every Indianapolis, there are literally hundreds of places that do collaborate. People are nice to each other. But there's no formal structure for this stuff. And there's no way to organize ideas, people, and capital. So you have the transformative effect that you all have had. And for every Copenhagen, our cities just don't know what they own. They don't understand what public wealth is. And that's why a New York City has a $111 billion deficit on retrofitting its subway system. The wealthiest city in the world can't figure out how to get the value accretion from real estate to put back in its infrastructure. That's a structural problem. It's not a capital problem. It's a structural problem. We need to change the way we do business. So, bottom line, what we're telling folks, there's a lot of depth and specificity in the book. What's your edge? Who are you? You know, you can't be the Silicon Valley of the, there's one Silicon Valley, right? And by the way, it's choking on congestion and it doesn't have enough affordable housing. So a lot of what's going on in the country right now is a bunch of companies are leaving Silicon Valley and saying, oh, Indianapolis, that's a good place, right? A lot of talent, a lot of stability, a lot of corporate philanthropic leadership, governmental leadership. So what's your edge? What are you good at? Who's in charge? You know, in some respects, a lot of people are now in charge, and it makes it a little more difficult. The mayor, right? The head of the corporation, the CICP, the chamber, major employers, philanthropies. You've got great philanthropies here. Universities, you've got great universities. A lot of people are in charge. So this is about networks. Cities are not governments. Cities are networks. Governments can be hijacked by partisanship. Cities are networks. They focus on pragmatic results. And finally, where's your power? And I'm not just talking about governmental power. That's a 20th century idea. I'm talking about market power, civic power, and how you understand what you have, the wealth that is in this community, private, civic, public, organize it for transformative effect. So you're already there. You are so far ahead of most parts of the United States because you've already built the kind of network. Now you've got the 20-year-old problem. How do we take what we've built, the platform, the foundation, the infrastructure, and take it to the next step? And I think, you know, in this country right now, how many people watched the State of the Union the other day? I have to say, it's another 20th century construct. The notion that we're going to wait for the leader, right? One president, one vice president, a House and a Senate. We're going to wait for the leaders to tell a country of 340 million people how to move forward is a 20th century notion. This is the level that we're going to move the country forward. This is the level we're going to create a robust, resilient, innovative, prosperous economy. This is the level we're going to solve some of the toughest challenges. And that means we need a different view of leadership and a different view of the institutions that leaders use to solve problems and move the economy forward. So it's a new century. It took a while to get started, but it's a new century. And I fundamentally believe that you guys have entered the 21st century prepared to succeed. The question, as we go forward this morning and beyond, is what do you do with this incredible infrastructure that you've built? I think that's the major issue for this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce, very much. We are now going to move to expand our conversation, both to the panel here and to you who have joined us as well. I want to introduce our moderator for today, Melina Kennedy, who has played a pivotal role in many Indianapolis initiatives and is a big part of the story that we've been discussing here today. Melina served as deputy mayor for Indianapolis Mayor Bart Peterson at the beginning of the 21st century. In that role, she helped to lead the effort to attract new investment, retain long-term investors, and build new partnerships for the city, for the workforce, for economic development, for neighborhoods. She was a really active, energetic person and presence in the community. I'm very biased about Melina because of one particular thing that she did that, that meant a huge amount. When she was a deputy mayor, she ended up becoming one of the original drivers, really one of the founders, of BioCrossroads back in 2002. Mayor Peterson said, I want that initiative, if it's going to happen, to be about something, and Melina can make it happen and be about something. And so, along with then the CEO of CICP, David Goodrich, and Ann Shane, a long-term public servant in her own right and community leader, the three of them, and I pitched in on this as a community volunteer as well, on some of the money and finance side. But Melina really, from the city's standpoint, drove the formation of what became BioCrossroads. We didn't know it was going to be that in the beginning, but that's what it really became. And it took that kind of drive and energy that she had, along with a farsightedness that you don't always see coming in the public sector, as Bruce talked here today, to put something together that was really here for the long haul. So there is nobody better who could moderate this discussion today than Melina Kennedy. And she has taken her leadership skills, I should add, to the private sector. She today serves as the executive director for global rail and defense business for Cummins. And Melina, why don't you come up and start this conversation? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you. I've got a couple microphones on here. Can you hear me okay? It's such a thrill to be here to talk about new localism and to be here with such a distinguished room of people. And it's my pleasure to moderate an incredible panel who I will start out by introducing. As I introduce you, just come on up and have a seat. I think Bruce already acknowledged him, but we also have our mayor of South Bend here, Mayor Pete. Thanks for joining us. So it's my pleasure to introduce one of our panelists, Mayor Joe Hogsett. I know he's here. There he is, okay. Mayor Hogsett took office in 2016. You may also know him from his previous public service roles. He was Indiana's Secretary of State, and he was a United States Attorney for the Southern District of Indiana. As mayor, his focus is on preventing crime, protecting taxpayers, and creating opportunities for working families. He's also dedicated to investing Indianapolis's resources back into our neighborhoods. He's a lifelong Hoosier and a graduate of IU. David Johnson, who really needs no introduction, but I want to introduce, never takes enough credit for all of the work here that's being talked about today, and I won't embarrass him, but he was instrumental in many of the things that Bruce and Jeremy are talking about in their book and we'll be talking about here today. But in any event, you know him as the president and CEO of CICP, the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, which we'll talk a little bit here on the panel about the uniqueness and criticality of that organization. Since 2005, he has also served as president and CEO of the BioCrossroads Initiative, which he co-founded with other community leaders. He was not a very good student. He's an honors graduate of Harvard University, Harvard Law School, and Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. So we are very lucky to have someone as talented as David serve in the capacity that he does today. Bruce, who you just had the opportunity to hear from, and is the co-author of the book we're here to talk about today. He's the inaugural Centennial Scholar at the Brookings Institute. He focuses on the challenges and opportunities of global urbanization. He is also the head of the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Initiative on Innovation and Placemaking, a collaboration with a New York-based project for public spaces focused on cross-disciplinary approaches to city building. He received in 2006 the very prestigious Heinz Award in Public Policy. And he's a graduate of Brown University and Yale Law School, so also not a very good student. That's just terrible. Also amongst us today is Jeremy Nowak. Please come on up. He's a distinguished visiting fellow at Drexel University's Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation. He's the co-founder of the Reinvestment Fund, one of the largest community investment institutions in the United States, and he chaired the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. He's now the chief strategist for Spring Point Partners, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and on the board of directors of the University City Science Center in Philadelphia. He holds a BA degree in philosophy from the Pennsylvania State University and a PhD in cultural anthropology from the New School for Social Research. He holds an honorary doctorate degree also from Villanova University and LaSalle University. And last but certainly not least is Amy Liu. If you want to come on up. She's the Vice President and Director of the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. She is also the Adeline M. and Alfred L. Johnson Chair in Urban and Metropolitan Policy, and she's a national expert on cities and metropolitan areas, adept at translating research and insights into action on the ground. In 2011, Amy was lead editor of Resilience and Opportunity, Lessons from the Gulf Coast After Katrina and Rita, a volume of essays exploring ways to accelerate the region's recovery. Prior to her work at Brookings, Liu was special assistant to HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros and staffed the U.S. Senate Banking Committee's subcommittee on Housing and Urban Affairs. She's a graduate of Northwestern University, a Midwestern girl from Illinois, and she completed Go Big Ten, and she completed the High Impact Leadership Program at Columbia Business School. So this is an incredibly distinguished panel. My job as moderator is to ask them good questions, keep the conversation going, make sure we leave enough time for you to ask questions, so be thinking of your own questions, and then end on time so you can all get back to your busy days. So I apologize, I probably spoke fast in the introductions because we're anxious to hear from each and every one of you.
Oh, good. Okay.
So with that, I'm going to start and ask the co-authors of the book just to start, Bruce and Jeremy. So we've heard about this new localism concept, and you talked about what drove this. Is this the new norm for the long haul, or do you think this is sort of a temporary stop? And as you talk about that, what is the role of the federal government going forward?
Well, the book's very clear that there's a significant role, vital role for the federal government. If you think of the federal government as a platform, it has a bunch of things that it has to do: national security, R&D, the safety net, the constitutional law, the integrity of markets. We can go on. We could all sort of build the list for that. But over the long term, we think, because of our observations about the shifting nature of power and where economic value, in fact, is created and where people live, we do think that this is a structural shift, not simply a cyclical change. And that means, and that you can see, Bruce noted, in globalization, right? So we don't know exactly what, the nation state, we forget sometimes, is really only 300 or 400 years old. It's been around for about 400 years, at least the modern nation state. Prior to that, there were multi-ethnic empires, there were city-states, but the nation state's a relatively new political formation. The nature of globalization is such that the functions of the nation state in some ways are shifting. We don't know exactly what that will look like. And it's also clear that many of the subnational parts of various nation states are either seeking independence in some cases, sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it's lunacy, or they are renegotiating autonomy. And they can renegotiate autonomy in part, either in a pragmatic way, as we're talking about, or in terms of governance, because they have a set of global institutions that they can, plug and play with. That's really different, and that will not change as we move forward.
Very good.
Yeah, I would just say that a small philanthropy in this city has more discretion than any cabinet secretary in Washington, D.C. today. So I was chief of staff at HUD under Henry Cisneros, under Bill Clinton. And every day we'd have a line of mayors out the door, and we'd be doing this and doing that and doing this. The old style activist government, That's over. That's over. Occasionally someone does something intelligent in a federal agency. But for the most part, there is no discretion, there is no fiscal freedom to innovate, to take risks. That's at this level. So, this is a structural shift, and it's not coming back anytime soon. And we put out a newsletter today where we talk about how talented workers are leaving the federal government in droves. So if anyone thinks in 2020 or 2024 or 2028, we're going to have a national government that snaps back into some kind of corrective role, there's no institutional knowledge in most of these places. So this is the level. It's like a get a grip time in the United States. This is the level that we're going to have to solve problems and move the country forward.
Just say one thing really quickly, and I don't want to hog time, but just, it's also true that in many states and in many cities, there's a diminishing capacity with respect to fiscal flexibility. So because of, and Indiana does relatively well compared to, Illinois, California, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, we can sort of give the list in terms of unfunded pension liabilities and other kinds of things. So public budgets, City of Chicago is a classic case, more and more are having trouble funding the basics because they are really in hock to the past, right? Which, we owe that, and we should be, but the budgets are really about the past generation, right? Old people like me, and they're less and less about the future. And so this book is really about, given that reality, that's the reality, right? What does it mean to fund or finance the future? And where will that come from? And that's the kind of conversation I think we are not having in the US, as long as we think that there's going to be some big government program. We didn't build cities with federal policy. Cities were built in much messier ways than all that. And in essence, what we're seeing is the kind of rebirth of a different kind of city building that's got to come to grips with these constraints.
Good. So for those of us who love Indianapolis and municipal junkies like myself, that's what I would call it, I was super excited to see Indianapolis highlighted in this book. And the book really is fascinating if you haven't read it yet. But it would be really neat to be the sitting mayor and read, we were identified as one of the top 3 in such a distinguished book. Mayor, tell us how you felt about that, and tell us how you feel about your responsibilities as it relates to this new localism concept.
Well, I take full credit for. Now, the truth is, what Bruce and Jeremy have identified, and appropriately so, when you read the book, is a 50-year journey that our city has been on. That is, in no small measure, peppered with visionaries who understood. Without even having the language, this concept of new localism. Indianapolis is the beneficiary of the vision as articulated of being the amateur sports capital, but then being able to look beyond that. So what we're going to try to accomplish in Indianapolis over these next few years is to take the lessons learned articulated in the book and improve upon them. The way I would describe it is, I think that previous mayors and I hope this administration represents more than anything else, no longer asking the question, if a challenge is presented to the city, how do we solve it? Rather, the question is and needs to be, who do we engage? Who else needs to be involved in helping us solve this problem? Today, I'm not thinking about, to Jeremy's point, I'm not thinking about waiting on President Trump's $1 trillion infrastructure package, right, Pete? Right, Mayor? I'm thinking about a pothole problem that we have in Indiana. Who do I engage locally? How do we address this issue locally, and not just potholes, but infrastructure generally? And how is that engagement going to be successfully capable of negotiating into the future? So I appreciate the book. I'm honored that Indianapolis has been identified as a place to look to, and we intend to keep it that way.
Great. So Amy, we had a robust discussion last night at dinner, some of us, about it's great to see Indianapolis has done some really good things, but we can't drop the ball. We want to move forward and build on the momentum, and what we need to make sure we do or don't do. Talk about how important inclusion is, how important it is to be sure that we have a welcoming environment, and how that could help or hurt us if we don't manage our politics, so to speak.
Great. First of all, I want to say my congratulations to Bruce and Jeremy on a wonderful book, and obviously congratulations to everybody in this room for doing all the hard work to deserve the credit and recognition in the chapter. You know, the chapter, what I want to first start off by saying is that the chapter was really about networked governance, and it was told the story of CICP. But I think the chapter really speaks to actually the larger capacity and strength of all the institutions in the city. And CICP, Indy, Chamber, the philanthropic institutions, the universities, you all have worked together really hard to create the transition that now everyone recognizes. So I think this is a high capacity region with strong institutions working together. And I think that's one of the reasons why Brookings is really excited about continue to do the work and partner with many of you on your vision going forward. You know, the chapter about Indy and CICP's work is about all the collective efforts to put this community into the future. And that future is rapidly changing. The environment we're in now, we've talked about globalization, but digitalization, who's living in our communities is rapidly changing. And the question is, how do we as a community take all the civic capacity and continue to be a global, innovative powerhouse that creates opportunity for all? And it's being, you know, there's real upsides to the technological revolution underway. It's creating lots of opportunities and new jobs, and you're seeing that here with Salesforce, huge tech growth, huge innovation, lots of venture capital investments, a lot of talent coming in, and capped by recognition from Amazon. Right? You are now in and benefiting from all the digital growth in the new economy. But that you also know that digital economy also destroys opportunities, creates automation, eliminates certain jobs, restructuring industries, changing the demand for skills and what workers need today, displacing workers, changing where location of jobs are going to take place in our community. So to me, inclusion is about how do you take all the civic capacity to adapt so that you continue to benefit from all the upsides of these global forces, but also ensure that more firms, more people in your community, and more places and neighborhoods and community are contributing to that economic growth. That's what economic inclusion is. And the one final thing I would say, because we talked about this at dinner last night, the future economy is going to be globally integrated. It is going to be digitally savvy. It is going to be multiracial and multi-ethnic, and it's going to be hyper-urban. And the question is this community going to embrace those assets in order for it to thrive in the 21st century global economy? And a lot of those aspects are actually being challenged right now, but I would say that you need to hold on to what those definitions are, the future economy, and make that your vision too.
Does anyone have anything to add on to that topic? David, having been on the ground level, co-founding BioCrossroads, but now being the leader of CICP, you sort of have a good perspective on what we're doing now and what we've been doing as a community the last 10 or so years. Where do you see the next 10 years in terms of focus and as it relates to this new localism concept?
That's always a good question, and it's one that we are constantly engaged in trying to figure out. To some extent, there's an opportunism to an organization like this and the way this community has been organized. It's important always to be looking out for not only a long-term vision, but really being sure that you've got the basics in place to take advantage of opportunities when they come. No one could have predicted, for example, I don't think, some of the tech opportunities, the advent of Salesforce coming to all of a sudden the Salesforce tower from the Chase Tower. It wasn't that we didn't think we had those assets, but we never thought it would happen in quite that speed and quite that way. And so part of it is just being ready, and I think Bruce and Jeremy do a really good job of setting that framework. Part of it is also understanding who does what. So one of the things about CICP that was important, and the NCAA here embodies this, this happened because the state provided the land And the private and the philanthropic sectors provided the dollars to get the NCAA to move here in a very short period of time. And the people who founded CICP recognized that's what the future is going to look like, whether it's about the NCAA, whether it's about technology. It's not going to just be about tax incentives and traditional economic development. It's going to involve a level of investment and commitment and focus to be able to make things happen. So our orientation is, what are the smart investments that we can be making going forward that will prepare us to be able to take advantage of opportunities that, again, as Bruce and Jeremy point out, are going to start flowing to places like this because there's a need for other places beyond some of the overbuilt sectors along both the coasts, frankly. And how do we really get into that game and compete in it? So we're going to have to find a way, frankly, to leverage more resources. We have wonderful partnerships, particularly with the city of Indianapolis and also with Governor Holcomb and his administration, and they're doing great things to help us do that. But we need to be able to look beyond some of the things that we've been doing here and figure out how to bring more resources to the best opportunities. I'm excited by the part of your book that has really focused on that and focused on the fact that you need to begin to really find out and leverage new sources of capital, and we need to pursue that pretty directly.
Our interest in this place, more than anything else, was that our view was that you had identified and operationalized an operating system for the 21st century. You figured you were the civic DOS for the 21st century. You had an operating system. Now, does that mean you've solved all problems? Well, no, of course. And Amy's, articulating of some of what is in front of you is really important. But you're ahead of some places because you've got an operating system. Will the operating system shift? Of course it will. Will it need to be, more inclusive in different ways? Of course it will. Do you need more of a startup community for, you're a big company community in many ways. You need more of a startup community? Absolutely. There's a lot of things that you can learn about placemaking so that you create the right kind of co-location of assets. We can go on and on. The advantage is the operating system. That's what you were identified with. That's really important. And many places don't have anything approaching that. And so they've got individual assets, but they can't figure out how to make 2 and 2 equal 5 because there's no operating system to aggregate that. That's what you've got.
Is it fair to say then a CICP structure is definitely unique as you've studied cities? Or not so much, it's just the way we've pulled the other resources together?
It's unique because it's effective. So we could come up with other cities that have put together these systems sort of, but they are, for the most part, not as effective. They're not driven by those who can actually make decisions. They become more like trade groups in some ways. Nothing wrong with trade groups, but they're not as future-leaning in terms of implementation. I think you've got a future-leaning operating system. That's what's different.
One thing I would add, though, to this, too, and this is something we spend a lot of time working with our colleagues with the Chamber on, we still don't have a very good way to talk about some of the things that we're talking about here and to describe what's actually happening here. And that's really important because we need to first have ourselves bought into what we're doing and then obviously make it compelling for the outside world to come here. We're not good at that, and we're struggling to try to figure out why we're not, but we need to get better at it really quickly. Again, the book is very helpful in that. 16 Tech, for example, becomes a really urgently important project for us, not only because it brings all the technologies together in one place, but because you can see it. Because that placemaking, that innovation district, you can point to that and say, that's what the future looks like, and that's what we're invested into. And we've got to have more things we can see and better things we can say to be able to get people really understanding what the opportunities are here.
I would say that CICP is unique because it's capitalized with large amounts of private and civic capital. And this country is going to see the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in the history of humankind. And a large portion of that wealth wants to reinvest in their place and their community because they understand national government's checked out and states don't have the capacity, as Jeremy described, to do all that's needed. So we're going to basically spend the next 3 to 5 to 7 to 10 years organizing, harnessing, channeling private and civic wealth in this country for collective impact. You are way ahead of the game on that. You've created the operating system for that. The question is, do you get complacent because of what you've achieved, or do you take on something like 16 Tech and say, this is going to be the most exciting, inspirational, technologically enabled, quality innovation district in the world? That's what you should aspire to. You shouldn't leave it to the Israelis. You shouldn't leave it to Silicon Valley. You shouldn't leave it to some of the Northern Europeans. It should happen here. And you can do it. Why not? Look what all you've done to date, right?
That's such an un-Midwest thing to say, right? That's what you have to get over, right?
Yeah.
So Amy mentioned that
Can
we.
I just add
sure.
one other thing too, in terms of what I think is really unique about CICP and all the partners here, because we do travel around and work with a lot of civic leaders. Bruce and the program has always talked about you got to build on your assets. You got to know what you make and do in the new economy. Most people still think job creation is chasing after that next firm that's outside the market. That's job creation, another Amazon HQ2, another Foxconn, another thing that's outside the market. That's not what you have been doing. You started that way with sports, trying to amass critical mass. But what CICP has done and what this region is doing, what everyone is now trying to figure out how to do, is how to intentionally create the conditions to improve the clusters and capabilities and expertise you have here by working closely with your firms and having really good intelligence, market business intelligence about what you make, what you need, what's the competitive environment that we need to create for your existing firms to flourish in this market. And now the community's building on that. You're focusing on skills with Ascend. You're working on 16 Tech, which is on place. We're thinking about other ways of investing in infrastructure in place with the transit investments. You all are creating a holistic approach to how to create the conditions for long-term, high-quality growth off your base of talent and people. And that is very powerful, and you need it. So to me, the other big lesson coming out of this chapter is intentionality. There's no doubt there's luck, a surprise startup, but there's a lot of intention too. And that story was about intention. And now I think this community is at a crossroads, right? Are we going to continue to be a knowledge center with all of this great capability, or are we going to be a community with a lot of inequality? Because a lot of that service jobs also generating a lot of low-wage jobs. What are we going to be? So that is, you all, as Jeremy said, you have the DOS, the framework to figure out how to be intentional about your future. And that's what makes me very excited about this community.
Well,
The DOS.
let's pause and take some
Somebody tweet
questions
that
from
out.
the audience. Mayor, when would you?
First, I just, to Amy's point, want to echo that everything started. Oh, thank you. Everything started to make sense for us in South Bend when we resisted the temptation. You come into office and everybody's like, all right, Mayor, are we going to be the next Research Triangle, or are we going to be the next Silicon Valley? Is it going to be biotech, nanotech? Pretty quick, I figured out, I don't know. But you can cultivate the conditions where what you already have can grow. We call it smokestack chasing. I'm not sure who came up with that term, but that temptation to go invent growth out of whole cloth. I wanted to unpack, Bruce, ask you to say a little more about the Copenhagen example and what it can teach us about public wealth. So you talked about how the city was able to unlock these sources of wealth. And I'm wondering, Indiana's practiced a certain flavor of that. There was, some of these P3s. There's some water companies that would love to talk to me about unlocking a particular kind of public wealth in South Bend. But I'm wondering, where do you begin if you were advising a city on how to create the inventory of what that even means? I assume it goes far beyond, city-held assets. What really does it mean to catalog and then begin to exploit your public wealth?
Why don't you take a stab at it, Joe?
Sure. So, I could, in a technical sense, if I went to the city, I could say, here's the databases I would look at. But the first thing I would do is you've got authorities, and since some of them are state charter, they have their own rules and regulations. You've got what the city owns. Often with cities, I see this particularly with very large cities, it's hard to actually figure it out because it's under 4 or 5 different departmental names. So literally there's a database problem. Nobody puts it together. The Board of Education has got its own thing. So you put as much of that together as you can. The real issue, if you're a firm, and this is the odd public finance issue, which is, cities have profit and loss statements. We call them budgets, right? Cities we know the liabilities because of bondholders and, pension fund issues. So we understand the liabilities. But cities don't have they do, but they don't really have conventionally accurate balance sheets where you really understand the assets, right? The asset side, the equity side of the balance sheet, right? And so I would first assemble as well as I could with whatever data was available, what those assets were. I would try to, I would try to understand the market value of those assets. And if I was a private firm, I would ask the question, what's the return? Do I understand the return on those assets? And then the question, if you're a finance guy, would be, gee, if I had a 50 basis point higher return on those assets, what would it mean to the profit and loss statement, right? How would I think about that? I would begin there, and then I would say, what of those assets can I get a better return on? Now, that does not mean, we're very careful in this book, this is not a privatization necessarily. There's some things you probably should sell, should privatize. We're trying to say that the argument that we have in this country, the ideologically polarized argument between government management, which very often is fairly mediocre in terms of the assets, not always, but in many places. I'm from Philadelphia, so I can just say we're terrible at it. And privatization. That opposition, look, the right kind of fetishizes markets. The left fetishizes government, right? And so we're caught. We can't really even talk about it and talk about how better management of assets would get us more public wealth, right? And so when I went to write this book with Bruce, I said, you've got to promise me if we write this book that we'll piss off both the right and the left. Would that be okay? And he said, I'm in, and I said, okay, And that's the kind of conversation, and you and you, one of the great things about Indiana is whether, for the most part, whether R's or D's, you've occupied, and this has been part of your ability to innovate, you've occupied the political center more than many other places. And that's allowed you to have those kinds of conversations. So in a technical sense, I could sit down with you and I could go over that, but then we'd have to have a conversation with the people that run that and try to understand what the issue is.
And just to add to this, because for everyone in the audience, how many people have been to Pittsburgh? I mean, a lot, right? So you go to Pittsburgh, we were hanging out with the mayor and the county executive, and we said to them, what do you guys own? I mean, just start, and I was a chief of staff at HUD, so my life was just windshield tours, I mean, that's like a good day. Get out, run around, look at stuff, get some decent food, that was basically the day. So they took us to this parcel, this massive parcel, which is right next to Robot Row, the Uber facility, et cetera. And it's where the garbage trucks go to park at night. It's literally on the river, right? The garbage trucks, the police cars, and if you're stupid enough to get your car towed, that's where they take it, right? This cannot be the highest and best use of this particular parcel. I mean, this is like absolutely insane, right? Probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And what we're saying to them is, don't sell that, don't privatize it, right? Put it in a portfolio and begin to manage it for collective yield, right? And that's what we're based on. And if you guys, when you leave here, I would just say, drive around the city and just start saying, who owns that thing? I'm sorry, Mayor, but because I don't want them to complain to you, but start looking at your city from an ownership perspective, because that's where the value is. And a lot of this ownership, by the way, is privately owned, and the private owners, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, actually want to think about a different use. So it's not just the public wealth, but there may be legacy uses that's privately and civically held that now can be transformed for other purposes.
Want to make sure we have enough time for any other audience questions? Kira.
Thank you. As we're looking at assets that can be capitalized, I work in the cultural community. I think we in Indianapolis have been great partners, I think, to our economic development efforts. But I'm curious to know if you all have thoughts on a vision for what that kind of partnership looks like moving forward, and how we in the cultural community can play a greater role in helping support economic development efforts.
So just two quick things I'd say is that cultural institutions are one of the major attractors and major, creators of sense of place and identity, and are really important to the issues that Amy's talking about in terms of who wants to be here. It also, though, I would say that the operating system for many of the kind of well-known cultural institutions, the same forces of demography and technology and economic change that have upended many companies are also upending the business models for museums and orchestras, right? So I think the question of rethinking, so they have the same problem, often without the balance sheets to do that. They have to figure out not just how to partner, which is absolutely important, but how to repurpose. The age when people will buy a subscription to a place to go to the orchestra 12 times and actually think they're going to be there on Tuesday at 7:30, that's over, right? And they may. So you can see the transformations that are happening right now. Some leaders of those institutions have gotten the memo and some have not, right? Now, so that's one part of it, but absolutely critical cultural institutions. I would say one other thing, which is the intersection and interplay between art, design, and innovation, including in your businesses, is absolutely critical. And people, when you think of cultural institutions, they think of it as an attractor that's kind of apart from everything. That's the amenity, that's the nice thing to do. Think about the technology community in Los Angeles. It's all about related to, animation, visualization. It's an artistic framework. So I would never underestimate, and in fact, in the conversation last night, somebody brought up the issue of design. Where do you have, you're an industrial place, you have certain design capabilities and legacies, some design you don't. This issue of the role of design, the role of the way we rethink a product, the way we rethink a process, is in many ways, an artistic attribute. And so the intersection of those things, it's not going to be just the B schools. In many places, it's the D schools. It's the design places. And it's the intersection and the relationship between the design places and many of the companies that are going on. That's another one of these changes that is happening. So I would say that the issue of culture and place, issue of culture and prosperity, issue of culture and partnership with the community is a much, much more complicated one than just this is a nice amenity. It's something much more than that.
So it looks like we're at the end of the hour. Just in closing, Amy mentioned everyone here should know we're on the top 20 list for the Amazon headquarters, which is super exciting. So just to close, to put you on the spot, Amy, Bruce, and Jeremy, what's one thing, we're proud of where we are, but we always want to raise the bar. One thing, because there's probably many, you think we ought to focus on that could help our chances for the Amazon headquarters and into the future?
My sort of focus right now is investing in young children. I really think that the places that are going to attract, maybe it's the Amazon now, but the companies of the future are places that basically say to those companies and to the existing ecosystem, we are going to enable and equip our children, all of our children, to participate in the 21st century. And we're going to harness the capital here to do it in an effective and quality way. Those are the places that are going to win. That's not a traditional economic development thing, but that's sending a signal. We invest in the future. And what else is the future but our kids?
So first I want to, I agree with that. I think my comment's going to all focus on growing your homegrown talent. And before I do, I want to say that we've been working really closely with the Indy Chamber on inclusive economic development. And I really want to acknowledge how much great work they have done in acknowledging that while there's great job growth and great opportunity in this community, that at the same time, there's a lot of low-wage jobs and a lot of poverty emerging in the community as well. And the question is, how do we create growth that really supports all of central Indiana? And so in that regard, Amazon is a transformative opportunity. It can be for everyone if we position the community for that in its assets. So what I would say is, regardless of Amazon, because there will be future business investment growth under the new corporate tax environment, we're starting to see more companies expand investments in the United States, whether it's reshoring or just expanding their operations in the US. So there's going to be lots of opportunities for the community, whether it's Amazon or not. One of the most important criteria of all the things they wrote in there was the fact that they were looking for a community that could generate 50,000 mid-tech technical workers. Think about that, 50,000. You all should just build that pipeline now for the growth that is to come. And when you think about that scale, we're not talking 500 apprenticeships out of Salesforce, right? We're talking 50,000. To get to 50,000 means high schools, school districts across the counties. It means partnering with the community colleges. It means thinking dramatically about your engineering programs. It's about partnering in the neighborhoods so that every part of the community can be part of the future labor force in the future economy. If you can demonstrate your ability to do that, I think everyone's going to want to be here, or your existing companies are going to stay here and expand, and you're going to lift up the wages and employments and prospects for every resident here.
Great. Jeremy?
I'm so cynical about
You
the
can
whole
say
Amazon
ditto.
thing. No, ditto would be the best thing to say. I couldn't say it any better, and I just would say the one thing that can, I'll take the question a little bit, turn it around a little bit, and it reflects some of what was said last night also, which is the one thing that can damage your future is by having a politics that is not tolerant of others. And that doesn't mean that we don't have, public values that are common about the way we behave, which we should. But I think, in the world that we're in, it's a world of difference, and public life is about the management of difference. And so I think trying to create a public life that understands and embraces those differences in a way that is tolerant, I think is, really important. And you want to be careful about that.
Very good.
Well said.
Outstanding comments. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you, everyone, for being here.
When it said a hashtag